the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
It is Thursday, September the 12th, 2024. We're still responding, reacting, reeling from the presidential debate earlier this week. My guest on the show, Wilbur Ross, is all too familiar with one of the debaters, at least, in the presidential debate, Donald Trump. He was the 39th U.S. Secretary of Commerce between 2017 and 2021 in the Trump administration. And last week, Wilbur Ross told, or perhaps warned, at least according to The Hill, warned Trump against being too strong, quote unquote, in debating Harris. Wilbur Ross has a new book out. It's called Risks and Returns, and he's joining us from the Grand Hill Club in Greenwich, Connecticut. Thank you so much, Wilbur, for appearing on the show. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
What was your take on the debate? Did Donald Trump take your advice? Was he too strong?
Well, yeah, what I meant was I didn't want him to come across as beating on a woman. I don't think the public wants to see a big, strong man beating on a woman, and I don't feel that he did. I think there might have been some other issues with the format. I think the ABC people ganged up on him. The only things they fact-checked were things he said, and some of those, I gather, weren't even correct. Their corrections were not correct, but they didn't seem to fact-check Kamala Harris at all. So it seemed like it was a little bit of a stacked deck.
I'm guessing for you as a businessman, there probably wasn't enough discussion on economics. What was your take on the conversation, if there was one, about the economy?
Well, Kamala Harris has been very, very general in terms of what her objectives are, and they seem to be shifting a bit. At first, she was in favor of the very high tax increases that President Biden said he would support, and now she seems to have come down from that a bit. So I'm not quite sure where she is. I know where Trump is on tax. He intends to not only leave in place the cuts that he made back in our administration that are scheduled otherwise to expire next year. He wants to go even further and cut it beyond that.
Trump accused Harris of being a Marxist, whatever that means. He's very dismissive of the achievements. Well, there aren't any achievements in his mind of the Trump administration. Of the Biden administration. What's your take, Wilbur, on the economic performance of the Biden administration?
Well, look at the difference between the economy now and the economy when Trump was president. When he was president, we had very low inflation, and we also had very low unemployment. In between, you had COVID, and that initially masked a lot of things, but what it resulted in was massive distribution of trillions of dollars in a non-productive way. Under Biden especially, there were people earning more money while not working than they had ever earned when they were working. And that seemed to me to be kind of an oxymoron. It resulted in very bad anti-work mentality. There's actually a Reddit site that has 6 million subscribers, and it's totally dedicated to anti-work. We never had things like that before, but when you give people more money for doing nothing than for doing something, you don't do a very good thing for their psyche, and you certainly start to change their whole attitude toward work. So I think that's been a very bad feature. And I think the social welfare programs that they've put in have been excessive and are what led to the inflation that we've had. Because when you create that much wealth in the hands of people who don't have much other money, what you do is you build up demand because they have what's known as a very high propensity to consume. So they built up demand, but since the money was not going into productive facilities, there was no increase in supply. And I think that's clearly what had the big impact on inflation.
Your book, as I said, is called Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life. Do you think your life is defined by success, both in your personal and in your public and commercial life? Do you see yourself as a great success?
Well, I certainly have earned enough to live very comfortably, and a record in public service is very much a matter of records. So what I'm proudest about and what was the hardest challenge in our administration was two very different items. One was trade reform. This country had been taken advantage of, often due to things of its own omission, for decades. And that was why we were having a big trade deficit. Our administration put in tariffs on steel, on aluminum, on electric vehicles, on all kinds of things. And people said, oh my God, it'll be the end of the world. There will be a big recession. And it just wasn't true. It did not have that impact. And tariffs never do. And there's a reason for it. When we put a tariff, say, on something coming out of China, the government usually absorbs part of the burden, the foreign government, by subsidizing that company even more. Then the company absorbs part of it. So those two components never get passed on. And then third, what happens if China is tariffed out of being competitive? Prices don't automatically go to the sum of the old price plus the tariff. They simply go to the country that's the next cheapest exporter. And that's usually well south of the tariff level. So that's why the tariffs were not particularly inflationary. And it's why, if they're well handled, they won't be again.
As you know, Wilbur, tariffs are very, very controversial. Harris brought them up in the debate, suggesting that Trump's obsession, it seems, with tariffs against China could actually result in higher prices. But Trump came back and said, well, the Biden administration in some way mimicked Trump. Do you think that Trump's, when historians look back at the Trump administration, certainly the first one, maybe he'll be reelected, his greatest quote unquote achievement was on those tariffs? Did it change the consensus so that it's very hard these days, for better or worse, politically, culturally, and economically, to be against placing tariffs on Chinese imports?
Well, there are a whole lot of questions in that, but the fact is the Biden-Harris administration, through the mechanism of my successor, Gina Raimondo, in fact has continued, and indeed in some cases has even gone a bit further on both tariffs and export controls than we did. So if she's claiming that they have a whole different program on tariffs, I'd like to see what it is, because it's not true. They, in fact, have been continuing, by and large, everything we did and then some.
We've had Gina Raimondo on the show. In fact, I went up to Rhode Island to interview her when she was the governor there. Are you suggesting then a sneaking admiration for Raimondo, given that she
Oh,
is...
yes. I like Gina. I've known her for about 40 years, because when she left the private sector and became the treasurer of Rhode Island, she invested part of their pension fund in my fund, my private equity fund, and she continued that when she was governor. So I have a decent working relationship with her. And in fact, at her invitation, when the CHIPS Act was finally up for a vote, on her behalf and mine, I wrote to every Republican member of the House of Representatives saying that even though the Democrats put a lot of lollipops on the original CHIPS bill, I felt they should still vote for it, and they did. Now, the lollipops were objectionable. They took the $50 billion that we had requested to build fabricating facilities for semiconductor in the U.S., and they added to it $450 billion, 9 times as much, for various social welfare programs. Well, they still called it the CHIPS Act, but it really should not have been.
Maybe, Wilbur, they should have called it the Lollipops Act.
Well, I think it was mostly lollipops, but I felt that the national security implications of our continuing to be so dependent on imported chips. At that point in time, we were around 75% dependent on foreign chips. And at the low end, China was the largest supplier. South Korea and Japan were the other two big suppliers. I think it's intolerable to have that vulnerability. And so one of the other problems that the administration did create with the CHIPS Act was not only putting all these lollipops, but also adding the $450 billion is a lot of what contributed to the big inflation that we got.
Wilbur, as I said earlier, you're the oldest person to ever be in the cabinet. You're a wealthy, successful man. Your book is called Risks and Returns. What was the risk for you of joining the Trump administration? There are no secrets about Donald Trump. You've known him for many years. And what was the return for you in participating in his very controversial administration?
Well, I met him in a very controversial fashion, namely at the time when the Trump Taj Mahal went into default on its first mortgage bonds. The bondholders hired me to try to help them get their money back, and we did. So I met him under very adverse circumstances, and it was a very public, very aggressive war of words between us. But we finally, after many months, reached a good conclusion that worked for the bondholders and worked for him. But a strange thing happened at the very end. We held this big press conference, as I describe in the book, and after it, having had a very long day and a very stressful day, I got in the car to be driven home, and the phone rings, and it's my mother. She said in about this tonality, "This is your mother." I said, "Well, hi, Mom. How are things?" She said, "Not good. My friends and I have been playing mahjong, and we all agreed that with all those mean things that Trump said about you, you never should have made a deal with him." So I said, "Well, Mom, that's what I was hired to do. That's what the bondholders wanted." And she said, well, I think you've lost all your self-respect. And if you had only become a lawyer, like I always wanted you to, you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. And then she hung up on me.
Did you ever speak to her again? Did she forgive you?
Yeah, she did ultimately. Not about not being a lawyer. She still
Do you think she would have been proud, Wilbur, that you worked in the Trump administration?
Sure, absolutely. And because I knew him for a long time and knew him in many ways more intimately due to the bankruptcy than most people, I think I understood him better than a lot of the people in the White House and in the cabinet. And the difference there is that some of those people were not really Trump people. Remember, when he first ran, he had never really run for public office before. So he didn't have a big cadre of people around him. And he especially didn't have a big cadre of people with government experience, including I didn't have full-time government experience. That resulted in a misfit of quite a few of the initial appointees. And that's in turn what resulted in a lot of the turmoil and a lot of the leaks, because some of these people who were not on board used leaks to try to get press pressure to get him to change his views. So if he's elected this time, he now has an awful lot of people he knows.
Would you do it if he invited you back? Would you do it again?
Well, I think it's a little early to divide the spoils. Right now, the real mission at hand for him is to get reelected.
Are you a big supporter, though? I mean, are you?
Yeah, I'm raising money for him.
And coming back again to this question I asked you earlier, the book is called Risks and Returns. You didn't need this aggravation, Wilbur. It's a lot of work, a lot of aggravation. I'm sure you were vilified by many people,
Right.
as your mother vilified you when you originally dealt with Trump. What's the return in doing this? You could have been enjoying yourself. I'm not sure if you play golf. You could have been having fun with your wife and your family.
Well, it got me to Washington, and I found that a fascinating experience in many regards. First of all, it was an opportunity to give something back to the country. I started out life in a family of fairly modest means. My father had a little two-person law firm in a small town in New Jersey, and my mother was a third-grade teacher.
Yeah, Weehawken, New Jersey. That's where you grew up.
Yeah, well, I was born
You were born there, and then you grew up in North Bergen.
Yeah, what happened was North Bergen was too small to have a hospital. The nearest hospital was Weehawken, and that's why I was born there. But we always lived in North Bergen.
Isn't that Philip Roth territory?
Well, that was big-time Democratic territory. And in fact, my parents were Democratic activists. So when I came to New York City, I was a Democrat initially and started raising money for some of the Democratic candidates, particularly for Pat Moynihan. And that in turn led me at age 29 to be appointed the treasurer of the Democratic State Committee in New York. But over the years, as I got to see the Democratic Party changing from being the party of middle and lower middle class workers to being the party of non-workers, I began to change, and I ultimately became a Republican. But I had to wait till after my mother died because it would have broken her heart that.
What about your father?
Well, he had died when I was young.
Okay.
That's why.
Tell me the values that you were. This is a book about your life, creating success in business and life. Do you believe that your parents, your father, who unfortunately died when you were young, but particularly your mother, did they instill particular values, or would you have been a success, Wilbur, wherever you were born?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with their system of values. My mother worked very, very hard as a school teacher, and in fact, she continued teaching until she reached 71 years of age, which is the mandatory retirement age in New Jersey. And when she hit that benchmark, she got the town to rehire her as a temporary teacher when some other teacher would go in sick or on some other reason they couldn't perform. So she was devoted to the children, loved teaching, and every day after the school let out around 3 o'clock, she would spend well into the evening doing up her lesson plan for the next day, marking scores on their exams. She was the way school teachers used to be, and she was very in favor of instilling fundamental values to the children, not like some of the nonsense that goes on in the schools nowadays, and not just in the public schools. It's just as bad in many of the private schools.
We did a show actually earlier this week, Wilbur, on the voucher system in America. Our author, probably doesn't share a lot of your politics, argued that Christian fundamentalists, the evangelical wing of the Republican Party, were taking over American schools and breaking down the boundary between church and state. Does that concern you in any way? It certainly probably would concern your mother.
Well, first of all, the real takeover of the school system has not been from the right, it's been from the left. This whole woke business, as you well know, started out as the Sunday colorama section in the New York Times without real historical research of any kind. And that's what really directly led to the whole woke movement. And nowadays, the teachers seem to be convincing their students to view everything through two lenses, the lens of sexuality or the lack thereof, and the second lens is the race lens. In fact, in California, there is a recommendation in LA by the official body that works on curriculum. There's a recommendation to drop mathematics from high school curriculum. And when asked why by someone, I think from the Milken Institute, the fellow who is the chair of this commission said, well, math is a racist subject. And this fellow said, what do you mean math is a racist subject? And he said, well, namely a famous black mathematician. I mean, that's a very weird reason.
Although I mean, this is, of course, anecdotal, Wilbur. I'm not sure it necessarily reflects on all math teachers. You mentioned earlier that you worked initially in politics with Pat Moynihan, who
Yes.
had some very strong views also on race and the differences between black and white families in America. What do you think Moynihan would think of the America of the 2020s? Do you think, like you, he would now be a Republican?
Well, I don't know if he'd be a Republican, but I'm pretty darn sure he would be opposed to this woke revision of history. You know, one of the Midwestern universities published a survey of kids 18 to 25, and two of the questions they asked, I think, were very telling in terms of the responses. One of the questions was, who was Andrew Jackson? You know what the main response was?
No idea.
Michael's brother, which obviously totally incorrect. He was a president some generations ago. And the second question that intrigued me was the question, where was slavery invented? The most popular answer among the young people was in the United States. It's obviously thousands of years inaccurate and thousands of miles inaccurate. And I don't think these young people were making it up. I
But do
think
you think that that neither of those answers particularly surprised me? But don't you think? I'm not sure on the data that you're looking at, but was that true as much of white kids as black kids, that they all thought that Andrew Jackson was Michael's brother, and that slavery was invented in America? Would there be much of a difference between white and black Americans on this?
I didn't see data that broke it down between the two. It was just a Midwestern university put out a press release.
You, Wilbur, you're known as, or you have the reputation as the king of bankruptcy. Is that a moniker that you wear with pride?
Well, I do in one regard, in that it suggests that I had a very good market share, and that was true, and I'm very proud of that. The idea of being the king of bankruptcy is kind of weird, in that bankruptcy, as I practiced it, was all about rehabilitating companies, putting them back to productive use, and getting rid of bad operations that they had. So that's hardly activity for a king. And I think when Fortune magazine came up with that moniker, I think they meant it in a form of approbation, not as a negative thing.
You, speaking of kings, your book is full of famous people, including your relationship with the current King of England, Charles. When you talk to him, does he joke with you about being the king of bankruptcy?
No, he never brought it up. My relationship with him was back when he was the Prince of Wales. He had a foundation, the Prince of Wales Foundation, that did an awful lot of charitable work. And every year he would host his American donors to two events, one around London. And so we would have dinners, lunches, whatever, at various of the palaces. And then in October, he would do an event up in Scotland at their castle there. And everybody would dress up in Scottish Highlander outfits, including a little knife and a scabbard by their socks. So it was fun. But what intrigued me the most about it, he and Camilla are both very straight-laced people, but Joan Rivers was the one American performer that they always had come to these events along with the British performers. The British performers were nice. They were opera singers, they were pianists, they were violinists, but Joan was quite a different thing. If you knew her at all, you would know she was given to vulgarities big time, and she had a very raucous approach to life. And Charles reveled in her bawdiness, and that struck me as very interesting. And in many ways, it humanized him for me relative to the sort of strict, stern persona he projects.
You seem, Wilbur, to be a little bit of an Anglophile. Is there a special relationship with Britain? You write about John Lennon in the book, who was your neighbor in the Dakota building where he was killed. Also, Richard Branson, one of Britain's most iconic entrepreneurs. Do you personally have a special relationship, if not with Britain, but with British people?
Well, I think both are true. My wife, Hillary, for years had been the president of the Blenheim American Foundation, which is the Marlborough family residence. And so we've spent quite a little bit of time there, and we spent a fair amount of time there on business, because I backed Richard Branson in buying Northern Rock, a failed savings bank that had been taken over by the UK government. And so that brought me there quite a bit. And I was also in Ireland a lot because we took over and rehabilitated the Bank of Ireland. So, yes, I am an Anglophile, and I think a lot of Americans are. I think that's always been true. A little less true now with some of the newer immigrants, but people who've been in
Say that. Why do you think it's less true with what you call the latest immigrants? Because they're not from Europe?
Well, a lot of us have forebears from Europe, especially from England. My own forebears came from Aberdeen in Scotland. So that's my own physical connection. And my wife's forebears came over from Ireland. So there is a historical association that we have, which someone who grew up in a Vietnamese family or a Chinese family or Mexican family or whatever probably wouldn't have the same feeling of historical relationship.
Do you think that America can learn something from the aristocratic system in Britain? It was originally the Republic, as you know, was founded as a rebellion against it. But are there things that America can learn from a monarchy like Britain?
Well, we of course fought a big battle against the monarchy, and that was the whole revolution. So I don't think we would ever dream of having a monarchy, but it's an interesting consequence of not having it. The British have royalty. Since we don't have royalty, we have royalized notoriety. And notoriety is held in almost the same esteem in the US as the royalty are in the UK.
Yeah, in a sense, your former boss, Donald Trump, is probably exhibit one in that, isn't he?
Yes.
Finally, Wilbur, your mother was a teacher. I'm not sure how much time you have spent in schools recently, but if I know you got to run now, but final question: in your new book, Risks and Returns: Creating Success in Business and Life, school children in America want to know. That's what education in part is about: is teaching them to be successful both in business and life. Very briefly, what would you tell a group of 10 or 12-year-olds, the kind of kids your mother taught in New Jersey, about having success in business and life?
I would tell them that the American dream, while they might be hearing that it's gone, it really isn't gone. What's gone among a portion of the American public is the determination to achieve it. The idea of working hard, doing better than your family did before you, and having a successful life is not a novel thing. It's a very American thing. And unfortunately, it's being partially lost track of. And that's due, I think, to the educational system. Remember, 2/3 of adult Americans don't have a college degree. So the idea nobody could be a success without going to college was never a feasible thing. It was a bad slogan, and it created ill will against colleges. But the other terrible thing, when I was a kid, there were 2 learning tracks that you might be on from grade school all the way through high school. One was a track that was headed toward college. The other was a track for kids who were not headed toward college. And they had other kinds of training beyond academic. We called it we called it training for alternate occupations. Now, the schools don't teach things like that anymore. We have the lowest vocational training of any OECD country. And that's a big, big problem. So in addition to not teaching math and science and physics and chemistry at the very high intellectual level, we're also not educating people for more, you could say, ordinary jobs that also can be very promising and provide a good life. So my feeling is that our educational system is the biggest risk our country has. I'm much more worried about the foibles of the educational system than I am about China or Russia or Iran. I think we have to get that back under control.
And maybe learn from other countries like Germany that invest much more time and resources in vocational training.
Oh, yeah, they do, and it shows. It shows very much. But our aversion to it is part of this whole reimagination of what school is meant to be. I don't think school is meant to be mainly a sociological experiment. I think school is meant, particularly in the lower grades, to impart fundamental skills to the students so that they can go on to a successful adult life. And one of the things I'm happiest about with the book, Yale School of Management is distributing 500 copies to all of their students and their faculty. Harvard has an undergraduate course, a seminar in entrepreneurship, and they've taken 250 books. So I'm very pleased that my book is finding its way at least to some higher educational institutions.
You know, be really proud, Wilbur. Your mother.
Yes, well, but I'm still not a lawyer. And so.
Well, there's still time. You could go back to law school. There's always time, Wilbur, right?
Well, that's true. I've always been a late bloomer. I became an entrepreneur at 63. I was the oldest person ever appointed to a cabinet, and now I'm a first-time writer at age 86. So
All right. Well, we'll get you back on the show when you go back to law school. I'm sure you'll get into Harvard or Yale. They'd be intrigued to have you. Wilbur Ross, the author of his new book, first book, Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life. Wilbur, real honor to have you on the show. And we'll have to get you back on the show in the not too distant future to talk economics and politics. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking with you.
Can I step on the